Welcome to The Jewish Lens, a podcast to discuss anything and everything from a Jewish perspective. Now, please help me welcome the man who controls the media, your host, Jonathan Rosen.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of The Jewish Lens. I'm Jonathan Rosen, and today I'm thrilled to welcome someone who's a journalist, media entrepreneur, and the founder, editor, and publisher of Canadaland, Canada's leading independent podcast network and one of the most influential voices in media criticism. Please help me welcome Jesse Brown. Jesse, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Jonathan.
Well, we have a lot to discuss, definitely, but I usually like to start by going back with people. So where did you grow up, and what was your family life like, in particular with regard to Judaism?
I grew up here in Toronto. I had kind of a typically atypical, I guess, Jewish upbringing, in that it was, Judaism was like a buffet, and we kind of like selected the parts that we,
Right.
I went to a Jewish day school up until grade 5. It was a Reform Jewish day school. So I grew up around Jewish kids in a Jewish community, though my family went to a conservative synagogue.
Okay.
We kept kosher in the house, but not outside of the house. I don't know. It was just sort of like
my dad. Yeah.
It didn't make a tremendous amount of sense, but being Jewish has always been a pretty big part of my personal life and my family life. But then after grade 5, I had behavioral issues, and I got kicked out of my Jewish school, went to public school, and most of my life has been, in secular society, and being Jewish was, raised my kids in a Jewish household and a big part of my family life. But I work and live as a diaspora Jew, as a downtown Jew, with everybody else.
So there was like a big Jewish presence in your neighborhood when you were growing up, or no?
Yeah, there was. It was a fairly Jewish neighborhood of Toronto, for sure.
All right. So much I've read about you before this it's just incredibly fascinating. So one of the things I read is like, while you were a teen, you launched the student newspaper Punch at Northern Secondary School, and it rated teachers, sparked controversy, was banned by the principal, but then it landed you on CBC's Metro Morning Talk. So could you just talk about that whole experience, and what was the spark that prompted you to do that to begin with?
Oh my God. All right. High school. I don't know. It was a big deal for me, entering into the kind of public school and trying to make sense of like kind of this wider world. And, whatever I was into, the things I was into as a teenager, be it like, punk rock zines and, counterculture stuff and the bands that I was into. But I was also really interested in kind of, everything from like Mad Magazine to Lenny Bruce to, kind of like this world of sort of rebel, subversive voices in media and journalism. And I probably saw the movie Pump Up the Volume too many times. And I decided that I was going to be an underground media figure. And I started this newspaper, and it was really important to me that it was like real. Like I got local businesses to advertise, the local comic shop, the local record shop, and I got my friends to write record reviews. It was kind of like a punk zine, but it was also, I didn't want to make noise in the basement. I wanted to we did this, I surveyed 100 students, and we did a report card of the teachers. And that got us in trouble. And the principal threatened to expel us all for publishing this newspaper. And then, the media likes free press stories. So the local, newspaper, Now Magazine, and then CBC Radio, they got really interested in who is this high schooler who's being censored, So that's kind of how it all started.
So, and you also had an internship at a radio station. I was Q107. So how did that plant the seeds for your later work? Did that start really inspiring you then?
Yeah, I mean, I was just always interested in media and how people, how people get the ideas, and I was interested in debate. So, my high school, even though I was a pain in the ass to the administration and the teachers, I loved my high school. Like, they had a co-op program there where you could, I got a job at this classic rock station. I was in the promotions department, but they also had a talk radio sister station, their AM station, and I formed a friendship with one of the hosts, and she kind of relied on me for like, what are the kids talking about today? And, I don't know, I would just hang around in the DJ DJ booth and like try to suck up as much as I could. And I went to a summer camp that had a radio station, and I started doing like talk radio shtick when I was still a teenager. So, I was just really interested in all this stuff.
I apologize if you hear my dog barking in the back, and he's like quiet all day until I get to do one of these things. So, all right. So I'm reading that you did a government-funded 45-minute animated film, something that I read that you called a fiasco. So I have to hear, what was that film about, and why did you, if that's what the track that you were going to filmmaking and animation, what made you pivot to journalism?
Well, I was kind of at odds with myself. Like I obviously naturally, was drawn to journalism and talk and debate, and as described here. And then, but meanwhile, I was kind of really interested in art and filmmaking and animation. And I went off to, I had the opportunity, like I was sort of celebrated as a teenager by the journalistic world. Ryerson was the name of the university at the time. They gave me this award, and then the Toronto Star gave me a reporting award. And I had offers to go into journalism school from like the dean of Ryerson's journalism school. And I said, I never really considered myself a reporter or like I was more interested in being like a shit disturber. And, I almost thought of it as like performance art or something. And I was like, I'm more interested in creative pursuits. So I went off to university and I started making films. And I made a bunch of animation short films. And I worked with, this really talented guy, Josh Dolgan. And we playing with little clay figures, making stop motion films. And our timing was such that it was the first .com bubble. And it was before YouTube, right? So there were all of these nascent video sites on the internet that needed short form content. And so we were getting paid to make little cartoons, little 1-minute cartoons. We thought we're amazing, we're just starting and we're already getting, paid to do this. And the worst thing that could happen to us happened to us, which is after university, we successfully got a government grant from the Canada Council for the Arts. To make we've made all these 1-minute films and 3-minute films. Now we're going to get ambitious. We're going to make a 45-minute film, which I do not advise anybody to do. Either make a 1-minute film, because film festivals love 1-minute films, or make a feature. A 45-minute film isn't good for anybody. What is that? It was the stupidest thing, and it took us 3 years. And when it was done, nobody wanted it. We couldn't do anything with it, and I kind of had a moment where I had to really think, is this really what I'm supposed to be doing here? Am I any good at this even? And I found myself coming back to writing and to radio. Out of, I highly recommend, by the way, spending a few years doing something you're terrible at. Seriously, it's a very humbling and instructive thing, to go down that, give it everything you have and fail. You actually learn a lot from it.
Yeah, well, that's true in anything. Yeah, absolutely. So, all right, like I said, I learned so many fascinating things about you, and I love this. I have to hear about this. You became known for media hoaxes, elaborate media hoaxes in the 2000s. So you tricked CTV Montreal with the fake babytalk.com startup and launching a phony magazine. So, Stu, I think that fooled multiple outlets. So before you got your own humor column for Saturday Night Magazine, could you talk about that a little bit? How did this all come about? What your reaction when everyone started taking it seriously? And what did it teach you about media?
Well, yeah, this is kind of part of the. I'm flattered that you're interested in this stuff. It's ancient history that some of it I'm embarrassed by, and some of it I'm like, it is what it is. This is how I got to do what I do. So I'm happy to talk about it. I don't know. Some of it was kind of fun. My mentality at the time, again, was never that I'm going to be a great investigative reporter or I'm going to be a great journalist. I was interested in media and debate and how truth comes to be understood in a more of a pretentious university student kind of way. And I was interested in there was this magazine, Research Magazine, was this punk rock zine, and they put out a book called Pranks, and I was fascinated with this book. And it was there was this guy Joey Skaggs who was fooling the media again and again with these ridiculous he would announce that he had opened up a bordello for pets. And it was national news. a cat house for dogs, and I thought, wow, they're all a bunch of fools, like the media tells you this is what's real, but they're gameable. They're this is before the internet made fakery and hoaxing, so common. This is back when mainstream media, there were 3 networks, there were major newspapers, and if something was written, it was true. And here I am, this kid, realizing, wow, if you say the right things, you could actually get them to say anything. And so my original, the first really
isn't that the media today also? Like that?
maybe, but I have more respect than I did back then. I'll tell you that. The first paid work I had in the mainstream media was this humor column for this magazine Saturday Night, and I would do these media pranks. So I would announce, Joey Skaggs was like my hero, and I'm like, let me see if I can do that. So I announced silly things like, this was in the age of Maxim magazine, all these lad mags, So I said, okay, all these magazines are about how you could be the hottest guy, you could have the best car, you could have the best model girlfriend. I'm going to launch a magazine for the average guy, Stu magazine for the adequate man. And it was like the anti-lad mag. It was a magazine about how to just get by and make money by being a medical research test subject, and how to get like the attractive girl's less attractive friend, and we, it was just a ridiculous concept, and it got covered in a national newspaper here. And I had another one that was about how this was the early days of the internet. There's a lot of internet hype. So I said, well, we've got a major breakthrough. We've got babies using the internet, like toddlers, before they could even speak. They're on the internet with each other. It's called Baby Speak, and the babies are doing virtual reality with it. It was a totally ridiculous idea, and that got on the news in Montreal. So I got hired to do these things and to write about it for Saturday Night Magazine. And for a while, I was like a media hoaxer, and it was really by accident that I found myself actually telling true stories instead of trying to get the media to fall for fake ones.
All right, so I'm going to get to Canadaland in a second right now. So but what I read is you pitched Canadaland to many places and got turned down before you launched it on yourself, right? Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
So how risky did that feel to you? And what specific, I guess, rejections convinced you that, it was better to go an independent route than keep trying?
Well, yeah. So what happened was that after the humor column, I started to say, okay, I think I've run this whole media hoax thing into the ground, and meanwhile I was falling in love with real, I everything that I thought was so silly about the news. Then I heard this show called This American Life. And at the time, it was before podcasts even existed. I was accessing it through their website, and these were these fascinating firsthand stories that felt so true and real, and they were real. They were journalism, but they were journalism like I'd never heard before. So, long story short, I said, you know what? I'm going to stop trying to fool the media, and I'm going to try to tell stories like this. And I kind of broke into doing audio documentaries for CBC, and then I was hosting shows for CBC. I was national public radio host here in Canada, and then I was writing for newspapers and magazines about technology. And I spent 15 years as a freelance journalist hosting shows and writing columns and things like that.
Right.
So Canadaland was at the end of that 15-year period. I said, I still am really interested in just this like media about media. I was watching The Daily Show, and I was reading, Gawker, this media gossip, but also expose site. And then I was listening to On the Media, the NPR show. I was reading David Carr, the New York Times legendary media columnist. And I said, we really need something like that in Canada, media about media. There's so much that's behind the scenes stuff that we could talk about. And nobody would hire me to do it. I couldn't get Canadaland sold to CBC. I tried as a TV show. I tried it as a newspaper column. Nobody wanted to talk about, how the sausage gets made. And so in 2013, I launched it by myself just as a podcast. I was very hesitant to do so because I took myself very seriously. I had a real media career. I had been on the radio, and here I am going to do a podcast. It was almost like going back to high school and just doing it on my own. It was humbling, but it was the best decision I ever made.
Well, tell me about Canadaland itself. What is the purpose of Canadaland now? Just to expose the media, or kind of like talk about what's going on with the media?
The original concept was to just have candid conversations. I was listening to WTF with Mark Maron, and I liked how he was doing these kind of, hey, I got the comedian here, is a famous comedian, we're just going to hang out and chat, and it's going to be really, really candid. And I thought, well, let me do that with journalists. We'll even have drinks, and it'll be like the best stories about journalism are the stories that are told after work. They never make it to air. That's what this is going to be. It's going to be like off the cuff, like newsroom gossip and story behind the story stuff. What I didn't see coming was, as soon as I like let it be known that I was interested in telling stories about the media, I started getting news tips about actual like scoops, like the anchor of the CBC's nightly newscast. This is like the biggest news anchor in Canada, Peter Mansbridge. He was secretly getting paid by oil companies to give speeches. Now, the oil industry in Canada, the oil sands, is a major issue, and it's something that he covered as a journalist. So this is like a conflict of interest story. Like, this guy is, presenting himself as an objective journalist who's, moderating debates on oil sands and environmental policy, and meanwhile, he was taking major checks from the Oil Producers Association. So that was the first big news story that Canadaland had, and it really, no one was doing this kind of reporting. These guys were kind of untouchable. No one, there was kind of a code that you wouldn't report on other media. And once we opened the door to that, the news stories the tips started flooding in. And I said, okay, maybe I could be an investigative reporter as well. And I started doing that kind of work.
So around this, I have to ask you this before I move on to the next subject. So around the same time, so you co-founded Bitstrips, and that's because everywhere I read about you, that's one of the things that always comes up. So which provided, like I said, a significant financial independence. So what was Bitstrips? I have to find out about that.
So, it was this minor thing. I've been 99% of my time is on media, but, as a freelancer, you sometimes find yourself out of work. And I was in between contracts with the CBC, and I was depressed. Like I just wanted to be useful, and I didn't have any good ideas at the time. But I had a friend from high school who was one of the most brilliant guys I've ever known. This guy, Jacob Blackstock, but we all called him Ba. That's what he went by, Ba. I think he still does. And he was interested in animation, which I had an interest in, and I just sort of showed up at his apartment. I said, "Can I be useful? Like, are you working on anything where I can help out?" And because I'm happy to volunteer, I just got to get out of the house. And he put me to work. He was working on a contract. I was like, again, very humbling experience, because I had just been the host of a national radio show, but now I was just out of work bum. And he's got me doing the most low level work possible, doing lip sync replacement.
So late last year, you released the 6-part series, What is Happening Here? It was a co-production with the Canadian Jewish News. It opened with episode 1, Unsafe or Uncomfortable, examining police data, showing Jews in Canada are 9 times more likely to be hate crime victims than in the United States, which is not great here either, but alongside personal stories of discrimination in schools, synagogues, and daily life. So for me, I can't go on social media without seeing something happening in Canada, in particular Toronto. So I've had many Canadians on who have told me how bad things have gotten there. What prompted you to do the series?
Well, just the situation you described, just the surge of anti-Jewish hate in Canada is astonishing. And it took a while to kind of figure out, like, well, this is terrible and nothing that we ever thought we'd see. But it's happening all over the world. Is there anything unique about what's happening here? Is there anything about the Canadian experience of this that's worth getting into? And meanwhile, there are tons of people telling us, oh, it's not happening. Right. You're making this up. This is actually political protests. It's not anti-Jewish, or some people would say maybe Jews are doing this on purpose to distract everybody from what Israel's. There's all this kind of noise you had to get through. Right. Can you really believe your own eyes? And it wasn't just like internet trolls. It was, people that journalists that I know and respect who are just seemed like nobody wanted to acknowledge reality. I just got curious about it for all these reasons, and I got, I think I had a reporter's sense of, like, somebody's got to document this, and somebody's got to, there's debate over whether or not these things are really happening or what they are or whether they're anti-Jewish or not. How do we get away from just the yell fest of two people screaming at each other about whether it is or it isn't anti-Semitism and actually get to some truth here? And so I spent 7 months just traveling around the country and talking to people, lots of people who said that they were victims of incidents. Also, people who are part of the anti-Zionist movement who say that what I'm doing is not anti-Semitic, not anti-Jewish, and really trying to talk to them in a different way. Like, okay, well, let's get to the bottom of that. Is it or isn't it? Like, what are you doing? And let's look at the impacts it's having. And so the result of that is this podcast, what is happening here. And I really encourage everybody who's watching this or listening to this to check it out, because it's you've been very generous in your interest in me. What is happening here is not about me. It's about the dozens of Jewish people in Canada who are going through this historic surge in hate, and I think it's a pretty unique document.
I follow you on social media as well, and one of the things you just, before we go on with the podcast, but one of the things you just said is like that people try to tell you that it's not happening, and that's the thing that drives me the most crazy. Whenever I post something about Jewish things or like anti-Semitism going on, if any other race would post this, any other minority would post something about what's happening, no one would touch it. If a Jewish person posts about anti-Semitism, everyone's quick to jump in telling you why it's not anti-Semitism. And if not, and I thank and people, no matter what the faults of Twitter, I'm always thankful for Twitter because it exposes and it shows all these things going on there too. And so with you, going back to you, like, all right, so episode 2, you explored cases of individual, the episode was The Purge, individuals being targeted under the guise of being pro-Israel, like you just said. So can you talk about that a little, and what did the reporting reveal to you about how this institutional rage against Israel has seeped into the workplaces, schools, and public life?
Yeah, I delved into it, and what I found, first of all, is there's no shortage of incidents where people are targeted for being Jewish. There certainly were cases of really like innocents, like people who have nothing to do with politics, nothing to do with Israel. Kids targeted at school for being Jewish, Orthodox Jews targeted on the street for appearing Jewish, and of course, we've had more arson attacks, vandalisms, fire bombings, shootings of synagogues. Thank God nobody's been hurt yet, but we've had more attacks on synagogues in Canada than any other country that I'm aware of. Jewish businesses.
Over the weekend, you had a restaurant I saw, right? Also.
Yeah, fired at. Jewish business was burned to the ground. So there's no shortage of things happening to people just for being Jewish. There's a whole other level, though, and that is, if you are Jewish and you go into a workplace, and this happens in Canada more than it happens in other places, but it does happen in the States as well. And all of a sudden, you're reading maybe within like official company, message boards, or within company emails or threads, or even on social media if you're connected to your colleagues, and people are saying things like, there's no such thing as a civilian in Israel, or they're saying, there's various comments that come really close, or maybe you feel they cross the line, and this is the person sitting in the cubicle next to you, or this is your boss, or this is somebody who's, maybe your union representative, and, okay, it's in a political context, but they might be talking about how it's legitimate to kill your family,
right,
in Israel, or maybe they're saying, all Zionists are racists or something like that. They're saying something like that, and you consider yourself a Zionist. What I looked into was not so much let's come to a conclusion as to whether or not that's anti-Semitic, but when those Jews want to argue, they want the protection of the anti-discrimination policies. They want to have a process where they can say, this is making me feel unsafe at work, or this is hateful speech that shouldn't be tolerated. I'd like to file a complaint. What they came up against in Canadian universities, Canadian unions, Canadian public schools is you do not have access to our anti-discrimination procedures because they don't cover this. They don't cover, either they don't cover Jews, which was the case at UBC for one professor, or we consider this to be political, and so we're going to not even have the debate or the discussion as to whether or not this crosses the line. And this is very strange. I mean, I think we all understand that if you were to say like, if you have a Chinese colleague and you say, the PRC, the country is so evil that it should be abolished, and there's no such thing as a civilian in this country, or to a Russian, that's going to have a very hostile, meaning to any Chinese person or Russian person. But the same consideration was not given to Jews in these institutions. So, the situation is that Jews are finding themselves without backing, without sympathy, without due process, and increasingly, they'll even find themselves, like, their union will say things that are straight up racist, and they feel that they can't stay, that this is no longer a safe place for a Jew. And so we're seeing what I call the polite pogrom, where Jews are leaving. They're leaving unions and arts organizations, political parties, hospitals. We have a terrible problem in healthcare in Canada, where the hospital system and the medical system has become a very safe place for virulently anti-Israel content. And one of the conclusions that I reach in the piece is, you know what? Let's stop debating about whether it is or isn't anti-Semitism. Let's just agree to what is nobody really debates, which is that it's hateful. Even the anti-Zionists will say, we hate Israel. We want to abolish Israel. I don't think you can call for the abolishment of a country without it being hateful. So why are we okay with this hate movement? It's a very strange thing to want to abolish. You should absolutely be able to criticize Israel. You should be able to criticize any country. But if you want to abolish a country, you're not criticizing it. That's not criticism. Go commit suicide is not criticism. That's a different category.
I get it. Anytime I post one of these episodes with the Jewish lens, I will get attacked. Doesn't have to have anything to do with anti-Semitism. Doesn't have to have anything to do with Israel. There's that particular episode. I could just be talking to a Jewish author, and I will get trolled in the comments. So, and what you mentioned with the schools, they're lucky if you even hear back. I've interviewed other people. I've had on Shabbos Kestenbaum on the show. I've had on other people who've tried to reach administration and were flat out ignored when talking about anti-Semitism. Their calls went unanswered. Their emails went unanswered. So none of this surprises me there too. And I want to move on to the next one, because the next one also is another thing that drives me crazy. The episode 3, what you had was the as a Jew thing, and that's always the one that probably drives me the craziest. Is I write about that one a lot. It allows the Jew hater, Jewish anti-Zionist, it gives the haters a voice to hide behind. So what are some of the things that you discussed during that episode, that you found out during that episode?
Well, I think that a lot of Jewish people have found themselves in these situations with conversations with family members or friends, where some of the most virulent anti-Zionist voices out there are Jews. Mm-hmm. And they're very quick to, it's sort of the first thing they say is that they'll use their Jewishness to give credibility to these arguments. So they become known as the as a Jew Jews, because they'll start every sentence with, as a Jew, I condemn Israel. As a Jew, it's interesting because you don't necessarily hear Jews who disagree with them using their Jewishness in the same way. They don't say, as a Jew, Israel is integral to my identity and is not a concept that started in 1948, or at least it's much less common. So in any event, I wanted to actually figure out what is motivating these people, because they're so beloved by the anti-Zionist movement because they are thought to lend so much credibility. Basically, how could I be a racist against Jews if the loudest member of my protest here is a Jew? I obviously am okay with Jews. So I sat down with this guy. I've known him for years. He's a thoughtful guy. His name is David Meslin. And I tried to understand why he's so active and why he believes the things that he does. And I tried to, I didn't want to have a debate or attack him or try to humiliate him. I really wanted to understand it. And it's a hard conversation to summarize. It really has to be heard. This is a guy who I think is very sincere, and, he really does want to do the right thing. But when you get down to it, he is participating in actions that have a very negative effect. He comes to the conclusion that any institution that has an Israeli flag in its, in its building or outside of its doors is a safe target, is a fair target for protest. And the protests that we have seen, to say protest, okay, that sounds a bit benign, but the actual protests that we've seen in Canada involve like horrible racism. Go back to Europe and spreading of Zionist conspiracy theories, pro-Hamas, which are not only offensive statements, but are also the kind of they precede the violence, and the same synagogues that have been protested then get vandalized. The same neighborhoods that are targeted with protests then get attacked physically. So, if we believe that hate speech leads to hate actions, and we accept that these protests cross the line into hate speech, which, Meslin did accept that the comments that these protests did cross the line, then inviting a protest to a facility just because it has an Israeli flag is essentially to open the door to this whole, slow process, not so slow, but a gradual process going from legitimate political criticism to illegitimate racist speech to violent racist actions. And his position is that almost every synagogue in Canada, and I think the world, is a fair and legitimate target because of the actions of Israel. And to the extent that he acknowledges that that does hurt innocent Jews, he justifies it and says, the lives I can save in Palestine, it's more important than the harm that's being done or that may be done to Jews in North America.
I don't know if this was covered in the podcast. I listened to the first one. Now, what about the going into Jewish neighborhoods? I mean, there was justification for that for them? Just walking around, just like, like I see in London, like attacks in Golders Green all the time, just walking around regular Jewish neighborhoods.
Yeah, I mean, you can just like set your watch to this stuff. There's a weekly protest in the most Jewish part of Toronto. For a long time, they stuck to the main intersection. And I interviewed one of the guys who's there with the megaphone giving speeches. And I said, why are you going to this Jewish neighborhood? Well, you should be at the Israel embassy if you want to protest Israel. And he said, I go to the Jewish neighborhood, and we go to the Jewish neighborhood because that's where the other protesters are, the pro-Israel ones, the pro-war ones. And it was true that for a long time there were, pro-Israel protesters who were calling for the hostages to be released and whatnot. And you get these rival protests on either side of the street. Well, the guy said to me, once they leave, we'll leave. Well, the pro-Israel ones left after the last hostages were released, but the anti-Zionists kept coming back. Only now there were no pro-Israel Jewish protesters for them to yell at. So what did they start doing? They started to walk from the main intersection into the residential neighborhood. And they started picking fights with people as they were leaving their homes. They started yelling at people outside of their doors. And sure enough, shortly thereafter, a Jewish old folks home, somebody went like into this, like it was a subsidized housing building, and somebody ripped mezuzahs off of the door of everybody there in the same neighborhood. Okay, was it the same people who did the protest? I don't know, but these things seem to follow each other. So finally, after week after week of this, the Toronto police finally have said no more going into residential neighborhoods, which is great that they're finally blocking it. But then it raises the question, why didn't you stop this from the beginning? Like, it's unthinkable to me that I would go to a Muslim neighborhood and start blaming people for what Hamas does in front of their homes. This is terrible behavior.
So you also, I know you went in. I saw something today too, which is, to me, I've been saying it for a while, and someone else posted about this today, about the As a Jews one as well, that it's just so much easier for them. Like, hey, I'm part of you guys, don't pick on me. And it's like, and that's, to me, that's the mentality behind it. Like, I'm with you. And it, that's the saying that, you won't be next, but you will still be in the same line. So it's like, it's the stupidity to me. But so I don't understand that rationale. But you also went to the government. You went to government, police, and talking about immigration things or other factors. So what did you find out maybe has led to this the way it is in Canada right now, in Toronto especially?
Yeah, I mean, I think I got to some insight as to why Canada has a situation that's so much worse than other places, and it's a combination of factors. One big part of it is that the kind of progressive politics that have turned into progressive policies that have been adapted into, in the States, it's like certain universities and certain organizations have, taken these ideas and made them into policies. In Canada, it's much more mainstream. It's become a much bigger part of the public service, unions, pretty much every university. So, and in the States, while that kind of culture has had its momentum, it's also had a strong counter force. And now there's a strong one where, Trump, of course, saying that you're not going to get federal funding if you do this stuff. There's criticisms that he's intruding on academic freedom, and I take no position on that. But as an observer of these things, I think that there's currents and counter currents in the States that don't exist here in Canada. In Canada, we had Justin Trudeau as Prime Minister. And Trudeau not only echoed a lot of these policies and a lot of the underlying ideology behind these policies, but he also opened the door to an unprecedented level of immigration. And I'm a very pro-immigration as the great-grandchild of immigrants and grandchild of immigrants. I'm very pro-immigration, but an unprecedented level of immigration, and it was a tripling of the Muslim population of Canada in a short period of time. Not a lot was done to naturalize people coming from countries like Syria, where it's a well-documented fact that people are taught in school to hate Jews, and that there really is no distinction between the actions of the Israeli government and every Jew you might meet. That is just how people are brought up, unfortunately, in some parts of the world. And when you open the doors to people, I think that over 90%, a very high percentage of these people are like absolutely peaceful neighbors, and I work with Muslim Canadians. I'm friends with Muslim Canadians, and I think that they're very much like any other immigrant story in Canada, very much like Jews. But we do know from attitudinal studies that there is a very high rate of anti-Semitism in this community. A very high rate. Almost half of Muslims surveyed in the biggest study so far shows that people agreed with very anti-Semitic sentiments. And when an instigating event like October 7th happens and people find themselves getting increasingly polarized and radicalized, it's at the stage. So these are the reasons why I think Canada, it's gotten so much worse, and it's really made cowards out of our politicians. They are afraid. They'll say, I stand against anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism has no place here. But they're unwilling to actually name the problem. The problem is the anti-Zionist hate movement. There is a hate movement on the streets of Canada. It is militant, militaristic. Its imagery involves guns and camouflage and smoke bombs and martyrdom. It waves the flag of Hamas and Hezbollah. It is an angry, violent movement. This isn't about people who think the Jews, who have conspiracy theories or have opinions about Jews. This is about people who hate obsessively and who have been allowed to hate very publicly.
Well, in anticipation of you coming on over the weekend, I looked up stats, immigration stats, and then I looked up the anti-Semitism stats. They perfectly coincided, from when it starts going, the levels of immigration started going up, the anti-Semitism came with it. So it's exactly what you said. And it's also, and it's almost comical, I see in Toronto, especially, it's always the joke on Twitter, the same thing, that something happens in Toronto, the mayor will come out, we must condemn anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. It's the one follows the other. They're afraid to make a statement just on anti-Semitism.
Yeah, that's right. There's this weird, which I think is actually incredibly destructive, because when you feel like you have to say, it's like you can't show a focused sympathy for Jews. So first of all, it's just insulting that you like, why can't you just say that you support Jews in their interest to not be discriminated against and harmed? So that's like offensive, but it's okay. I'm a big boy. I can be offended. What I think is destructive is when you then say and also there's a problem with Islamophobia. What you're perpetuating is a false construct
Yes.
that the interest of one group is somehow opposed to the interests of the other. And that it's like, on the one hand, Jews are being harmed, but on the other hand, Muslims are also being harmed. Wait a second. What does that imply? What are you suggesting there? The fact that both groups are being harmed, to me, is the same problem. It's the problem of discrimination. Also, this obscures what we're coming to understand, which is that for all of the talk of false flags and Jews being responsible for anti-Jewish violence, the actual names of the people charged and convicted are not Jews. And I've been meticulously documenting this. The vast majority of the names in Canada are Muslim names. Not exclusively, but but there's really there's I think 2 Jewish names out of dozens of names, and the majority of the names happen to be Muslim names. We have to talk about this if we're going to solve this problem. The Islamophobia, the Islamophobia, on the other hand, there is no evidence that there's any significant Jewish offense here, that this is being done by Jews. So, we have to be able to talk about this, or else we're not going to get anywhere.
So I was reading after you did this report about this, looking back now after its release, and I read that you drew backlash from people on your own staff about doing this. So what were some of the things that you took out of that, and the public reaction? Has it affected your view of, I guess, Canadaland's audience a little bit, and the broader left-leaning media system?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of us were surprised. A lot of Jews were surprised to find that people who had otherwise stood against racism were very uncomfortable at best to name this racism, to name this discrimination. And, it was a rude awakening to find that people who you thought you could count on their support, not because they were so supportive of Jews specifically, but because they hated racism and hated hatred, that they were not willing to stand next to us on this. Yeah. And that was true with certain members of staff, and that was true with certain people in my audience. What are you going to do? Right. Those people are no longer working here, and those people are no longer listening to the show. I took a hit, but that audience has been rebuilt, and our team is being rebuilt. Not necessarily everybody agrees with me. A lot of people don't, but that kind of house divided is no longer the case. It is understood that I'm going to keep saying the things that I'm saying, and I'm going to keep covering what I'm covering. And, it goes for audience members and subscribers, and for staff colleagues as well. Those are just sort of the table stakes of Canadaland. And if you don't like it, you don't have to be a part of it. And some people don't. So we've rebuilt. Well,
that's what I was going to ask you now, because as a journalist, I understand the being impartial or whatever it is, but has your series, the What Is Happening Here, has it changed a little bit your sense of responsibility? You're a journalist, but you're also a Jewish journalist in Canada where you see these things happen. So does that kind of affected you in some way, that you do have to kind of point this out?
Yeah, it's really interesting. People are like, oh, you're biased. And this is something that journalists were told, you couldn't have a black person covering the civil rights movement because they're biased. It's like, well, I'm biased in that I want to have equal rights. I'm biased in that I don't want to be violently, singled out. Is that a political bias, or is that a bias towards what should be universal values of equality and this is a conversation that I thought we were more progressed about than now, where a very progressive audience considers me biased. I very diligently steer clear of political commentary on Israel. I cover Canada. So yes, I am biased in that I think that Jews like myself, and I am one, guilty, deserve to be treated the same as everybody else. And that when there's discrimination becomes kind of just like a word that gets thrown around. What I mean is a double standard. What does it mean? It's a double standard whereby you're treating Jews differently than everybody else because they're Jewish. I am opposed to that.
So this is not a question for you as a journalist. This is pure opinion. What do you think is next in Toronto? Because, like I said, I've had many Canadians on this show, and flat out, like many of them have called, the mayor, Olivia Chow, anti-Semitic. So what do you think is next in Toronto? What do you see in the near future and long range for Jews in Canada, in Toronto especially?
It's really hard to tell. If you had to make an educated guess, I'm better, reporters are better at telling you what happened, what just happened than what's about to happen. We don't have numbers on our side. We do not, for all the talk of Jewish power and Jewish political influence, right. Like we don't have a big voting bloc. We do not have a lot of elected representation. And, if you had to guess, like based on the number of people who are filled with rage against Israel, based on what I'm seeing in the comments that people don't want, like they're very angry when you point out these things. Yeah. I would guess that things are going to get worse before they get better. I would guess that very sadly, I'm trying to make as much noise as I can. My fear is that the only thing that's going to get people to snap it into their senses is if something terrible happens. And I really hope that. Well, it's been really bad, but thank God we haven't had like a Bondi Beach incident, and I don't want us to have one. It's me and my family and my friends who would be targeted, and we have been targeted. I know people who have been targeted with explosive attempts, and people very close to me. So I don't want that to have to be what happens before people smarten up. My message to the rest of Canada is like, I'm done asking people to care about Jews. You don't have to care about Jews. If you can't understand that this is a violent hate movement that sees the entire West. When they say we want to smash colonialism and we want to strip Zionism from Canada in all of its forms, these people are explicitly opposed to not just Israel, but to America, to what they consider Western imperialism. They consider Canada to be a settler colonial project, just as they consider Israel. And this is an antisocial force that threatens everybody here. They're burning ambulances in the UK. So everybody's got to smarten up, because what starts with the Jews doesn't end with the Jews.
Always. So with Canadaland now well established, what is happening here behind you, what's next for you personally and for the outlet?
I'm continuing to bang the drum about the series. I want it to be heard far and wide. I'm talking with anyone who'll talk to me about it. Thank you so much for this great conversation about it. Meanwhile, we're putting out news podcasts about Canada all the time. We're doing media criticism. We're telling other stories. We're doing our work here and, just trying to make sense of an increasingly chaotic and wild world.
Well, Jesse, let me get first of all, how can people follow you on social media? Let's get that. That's the important question for everyone.
Hey, the important thing for me is go to your podcast player and subscribe to What Is Happening Here from Canadaland Investigates. That's number one. If you're curious about what I have to say, on Twitter, I'm mostly just documenting anti-Semitism in Canada, and I'm Jesse Brown on Twitter. And the Canadaland podcast for Canadian viewers and listeners, we're the best news podcast doing more or less daily coverage in Canada. So come subscribe to us.
Well, again, Jesse, I want to thank you so much for coming on, taking your time today. I know we got postponed a couple of times, so I appreciate you bearing with me and still doing it.
Thank you very much. It's been great.
All right, let me sign this off. Again, this has been The Jewish Lens. I'm Jonathan Rosen. Again, a very special thanks to Jesse Brown. Or listen to the podcast, subscribe to Canadaland, and please like, comment, and subscribe.
Thanks for tuning in to The Jewish Lens, where all items used was strictly kosher.